Market day in Jamaica wasn't always like this. 200 years ago, they weren't shopping for fruit and veg. They came to buy people. The ancestors of these Jamaicans were brought from Africa in chains. Those who survived the voyage were sold to plantation owners who worked many of them to death.
The slave trade was barbaric. It's a stain on British history. In Wales, though, I think we've always seen slavery as an English institution run out of ports like Liverpool and Bristol by the English ruling class. But can we in Wales just wash our hands of this huge historic crime? Or was our history in some way shaped by the fortunes made from forced labour in places like this? I've always been shocked by slavery. It was unbelievably cruel. Africans were ripped from their homes and taken to colonies where torture, rape, and even murder were everyday events.
It wasn't the work of a few psychopaths. It was a multi-million-pound industry touching everyone from the royal family down.
I've come to Jamaica 200 years after Britain abolished its slave trade to find out if the money made here found its way back to Wales. I'm going to look at three major players in early industrial Wales: an ironmaster, a copper magnate, and a slate quarry owner. I want to know if the empires these men built were in some way linked to the suffering of Africans here in Jamaica. And this is where the trail begins, in a tiny community at the heart of the island, with a very Welsh link. It's called Pennants, and it's named after a family who came here from Fletcher. The family also gave their name to their slaves, and many people living here are still called Pennant.
Sugar fields like these were at the heart of their Jamaican empire. 200 years ago, they were worked by hundreds of slaves.
It's hard to believe it looking at it today, but places like Pennants, which churned out sugar for the tea rooms of Europe, were like an 18th century Silicon Valley. And the slave owners, families like the Pennants, were the dot-com billionaires.
They may have squeezed a fortune out of the sugarcane which grew here, but money wasn't everything. This dense, prickly undergrowth covers an old graveyard. It was filled with the many Europeans who fell victim to tropical diseases.
Somewhere in this bush is the church where the Pennants buried their dead. And here it is. The Pennants would have probably come here quite a lot for the funerals of family and friends. The high death rate amongst the Europeans here is probably one of the main reasons why the Pennants decided to return home. When they arrived, they weren't just happy to be in Britain. They were celebrating the birth of a new son, Richard, who may well have been born on the voyage home.
When he grew up, Richard Pennant, the first Baron Penrhyn, was going to change the face of North Wales forever. Bangor University still holds copies of hundreds of letters he wrote to his estate managers in Jamaica after he took control of the plantations in 1781. He never saw them, so maps like these were his guide to his properties. These papers here are full of discussions of slavery. There's a list here of the slaves on one of the estates. Little Tony and Charles, they're both field hands, and the women, Delia and Eleanor, and there's even a midwife called Amina. These names are a reminder of the individuals who had to suffer unbearable pain at the hands of an inhumane system. I wonder how many had to wear slave collars like this.
There are lots of letters here where Pennant is asking for his managers to treat the slaves well. In this one here, he says he wants them treated with humanity and attention. But was he caring for the slaves or for his own bank balance? We'll never know for sure, but he knew his slaves were a valuable asset. When he complains that not enough children are being born to slave women, the manager makes clear that breeding slaves, breeding is the word he uses here, is cheaper than buying them. And he goes on to say he's offering bonuses to midwives for live births. There's no doubt that money was at least part of the concern. This is how he begins some of his letters.
I'm glad to hear the Negroes are well. The hearing good account of them and the cattle always gives pleasure.
He really did seem to regard the slaves in the same way he regarded his livestock.
While he wrote these letters, the cruelty of slavery was being exposed in Parliament for the first time. An inquiry heard about the stinking holds of the slave ships where Africans were chained together to live or die in their own filth. One witness even told how traders murdered a small child so they could sell his mother. Richard Pennant was well aware of this evidence.
Pennant didn't spend all his time here on this estate near Bangor. He was an MP for the slave port of Liverpool. He didn't believe the abolitionists' claims and used his position to become an outspoken champion for the slave trade. He said the banning of the traffic in Africans would be an economic disaster. As he defended one of history's great crimes, the money from Jamaica continued to roll in. But it's how he used his money here in Wales that allowed his heir to build a house like this.
Penrhyn Castle's such an ostentatious show of wealth, it'd make the Beckhams blush.
Marion, it's nice to meet you.
Good to meet you too.
This is an amazing place, isn't it?
It really is, isn't it? This room is, of course, very pink. It's the drawing room.
Right.
I'm hoping Marion Gwynne can tell me more about the Pennant's life in Wales.
The entire building, you've got over 300 rooms and over 70 roofs. But really it was a glorified country cottage for them. They had other houses elsewhere. They were here for perhaps 3 or 4 months of the year and they came here just to entertain.
What did Richard Pennant do to develop this area?
When he first came to North West Wales, the slate industry was already going, but in a very small piecemeal fashion. What he did was that he took back the leases and developed a unified industrial quarry on a massive scale. He built the road and the railway to connect the quarry to the port. He built the port and he owned the ships. So he could basically ship his slates to anywhere in the world to where they were wanted.
Pennant's great legacy is Penrhyn Quarry, which is still the biggest in the world. But he also modernised agriculture.
He was called Richard Pennant the Improver. He planted over 600,000 trees in the area.
So how important was the money from the slave plantations in Jamaica to these developments?
It was crucial. Without having that initial fortune to start with, he could not have developed the speed that he did. So the slave trade basically was the spur to create the North West Wales that exists today.
So this massive castle is a monument to wealth built up through the forced labour of Africans and reinvested in slate. Today, it's easy to attack Richard Pennant, but let's see what one of his descendants thinks.
Richard Pennant was probably one of the most remarkable businessmen of his time, ruthless in his dealings. He came in and rescued an ailing economy.
But the fact that much of that money was based on the slave trade, does that taint your view on him?
In a way it does, that he did use it, because what he did by today's standards was appalling. But you've got to remember that he was a man of his time.
But the slave trade wasn't just appalling, it was one of history's great crimes.
It's one of the greatest crimes ever happened in history. It was by far worse than what happened in Germany in the 1930s and 40s.
Do you have a debt to the descendants of your family's slaves?
Morally there's a debt, but practically, on economic lines, you can't do it because there's so many, generations have gone by
Through all those generations, one thing's for certain. The last 200 years have been kinder to the penance than to the descendants of their former slaves.
I've come back to the tiny community of penance in Jamaica to meet a descendant of one of those slaves. Latoya, it's really nice to meet you.
How are you?
Let's go back this way.
Latoya Pennant's family come from this village. Her forefathers were slaves, almost certainly owned by the Pennants. How does she feel about what happened to her ancestors?
Well, I'm angry to a certain extent in that I know what happened in slavery. I know that, they were all together in a little boat and they were beaten and all that on the plantations. And for that, yeah, I'm angry, but not angry to the extent where I'm going to hold a grudge or hold it to my heart for the rest of my life, because people have to move on.
Do you think they owe you for what happened in the past?
I wouldn't say it's something that's a must, but it would be good to contribute something to the community. Maybe there could be a center or something where that it would contribute to the social upliftment of whoever is here, but I don't think it's something that is mandatory. I guess it's based upon anybody's conscience if they want to do it, but it's not a must.
What do you think the legacy was of slavery?
The main issue is with finding out where I'm really from. I'm not sure if it's, I know that, our ancestors are from Africa. I'm not sure from where in Africa. Even though we have this philosophy where many people are saying back to Africa, if I should go back to Africa, where do I go? Which tribe am I from? Is it the Yoruba? Which tribe am I from? I'm not sure. So that's weird.
So the legacy of slavery still echoes down the centuries. But how much was Wales really involved?
The Pennants were one family, slave just one industry. Were there wider links, though, between the slave trade and the way Wales became the world's first industrial nation?
In the 18th century, people were drawn to Jamaica to make money from sugar. Today, they're drawn to beaches like this.
Like any major industry, tourism has huge spin-offs. It doesn't just make money for hotels, airlines and travel agents. The bars and restaurants, insurance firms, bureau de change, and even companies that make things like sunglasses all get a huge boost from tourism.
The slave trade was the same. There were spin-offs for shipbuilding, insurance, banking, and many other industries.
One of those industries was particularly important in Wales, and it thrived thanks to this clear, warm water. These tropical waters were home to the teredo worm, which would burrow into the timbers of ships and could completely destroy them.
Ship owners spent a fortune fixing their vessels when they returned worm-eaten from slave voyages.
And keeping the worm at bay made one Welshman very rich indeed.
Thomas Williams, a country solicitor from Anglesey, became the king of the copper industry and amassed a fortune worth billions in today's money. His empire was based on his copper mines at Paris Mountain on Anglesey. But he wasn't happy just mining ores. He began manufacturing his own copper goods in factories like this one in Fletcher.
It made copper sheathing like this, which covered the hulls of the ships to protect them from the worm. Now, there'd always been problems with this process, but a new type of copper bolt developed by Williams's engineers made it much safer.
Slave ships were one important market for this sheathing.
This factory was kept busy, churning the stuff out.
In its heyday, Williams employed 500 people here at Greenfield Valley near Holywell. Today, it's a beautiful country park.